When the month of April came around, we all know that Mumia was very, very ill. And I shared that information with my students, and I told them that the hospital was not letting him see his family. And so they decided on their own that they wanted to write letters to Mumia.
The ISIS fighters have been able to go to Syria through the Turkish borders, and the Turks have basically either been negligent or unwilling to stop that.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on over 30 cable stations from Vermont to New York City and beyond. Our YouTube channel is Struggle Video Media. You can watch all our shows at thestruggle.org. We've come to a critical point in U.S. relations with Iran. The two memes will show you say it all. The extremist governments of Israel and Saudi Arabia want Iran destroyed, and they want the U.S. to do it. Supposedly, these two countries are our dear allies, but if I might suggest, war is the last thing that the Middle East or our country needs. From the Middle East to New Jersey, at the outreach meeting for Newark's Million Peoples March, a school teacher talked about how she got students to write letters to a prisoner and what the school board did next.
Marylin Zuniga was a teacher at an elementary school in Orange, New Jersey, who was really having a Black History Month program with her students. And instead of just teaching about the people we hear about all the time during Black History Month, she started talking about more unconventional leaders. And she is one of few teachers I know that actually talk to her students about Mumia Abu Jamal. That's right. And she didn't try to, convince them to do this, that, or the other. She was just teaching. In fact, she was teaching. She's going to tell the story. I'm not going to tell the story. But the bottom line is the students learned that Mumia was ill, and they wrote get well letters. To make a long story short, the get well letters turned into a controversy which has resulted in Marylin being terminated from the Orange Board of Education. And it really hurts my heart, and those of you who've been to the board meetings, because some of you, and I want to thank you for coming over to support Marylin, support us, you know that we struggled during the 60s for Black power. And, whole land gonna change hands, right? And we put Black people in power, and we thought it was gonna be better. And in some situations, it's not better. It really breaks my heart that an all-Black Board of Education, all Black, but not a majority Black board, an all-Black Board of Education terminated Marylin for engaging in an act of compassion. And we're still fighting. This is not going to just be swept under the rug. We're going to keep fighting. So at this point, I want to decrease so that she can increase. Marylin, give her a big hand. Marylin Zuniga.
For those of you who are not familiar with my case, I will quickly or briefly tell you what happened with my particular case. I was a third grade teacher in Orange, New Jersey, and throughout the year I was very intentional about being a social justice educator in my classroom, and particularly with third graders. We know that elementary school students are very enthusiastic, and once they get interested in a topic, they are completely immersed. And so for the month of February, for Black History Month, we did a civil rights series of leaders who are often not covered in textbooks, who are often not included in our curriculum within public schools. And Mumia Abu Jamal happened to be one of those leaders that we explored. And so we explored him in light of his leadership, in light of his community organizing, his journalism within Philadelphia and his community. And my students were fascinated by Mumia and his work, and they were so fascinated to the point where they went home that same day when we explored Mumia, and they did their own research. And many of my students the next day came in with pictures of Mumia and essays written about Mumia and research done about Mumia. And so when the month of April came around, we all know that Mumia was very, very ill. And I shared that information with my students, and I told them that the hospital was not letting him see his family. And so they decided on their own that they wanted to write letters to Mumia. And of course, I encouraged it. I always encourage my students to express themselves through writing, but also to really pursue and take control of their own education. And so this was a perfect opportunity to engage in student-centered learning. They wrote the letters to Mumia, and a fellow educator and professor here at Baruch College, Johanna Fernandez, I told her about what my students had done, and she said, we're delivering those letters to Mumia. And those letters were in Mumia's hands that following Tuesday. And Mumia was so ecstatic to read those words and those letters from my students that he stood up that day. And he wasn't able to stand up in a really long time. He was happy, he was ecstatic, he became very emotional, and he was able to take pictures with folks who were visiting him that day. And so Pam was there. and so there's so much power in what children can do, right? And what children can do through their voice and through their control of their own education. And so the reason why I'm here today to promote this Million Peoples March Against Police Brutality is because, especially highlighting what happened with my case, and it's not unique to me or my students, it's happening to teachers, and it's been happening to teachers for so long nationally, that it's so important to highlight that police brutality doesn't just stop on the streets. I mean, we are being abused in our classrooms, so much so that police have control over our curriculum in schools. And so that is exactly what happened with my case, and that's exactly what's happening in classrooms around the nation. And so we have to come together, and I speak particularly to educators in this room and also everyone here. We all know at least one educator, right? One teacher, someone who's been in education or who is in education. And so I think it is so important to highlight that educators are there on July 25th to realize that this fight is not exclusive to just what we see happening on the streets, right? And so we can talk about Tamir Rice and we can talk about Aiyana Jones and those tragedies. It doesn't stop there. We don't just get harassed on the streets or in our homes, but also in our classrooms, and we're limited. And we need to start speaking up about the police violence that's going on within our schools. And so the school to prison pipeline, we all know, is so real.
Right.
But it doesn't just stop with metal detectors. It doesn't just stop with our students being arrested in schools. It doesn't just stop with suspensions or expulsions. It goes on so much deeper than that and so much more systemically that we don't even talk about that on the daily basis, about how our curriculums are controlled, how our curriculum is scripted, and how teachers are so limited to the point where we cannot even teach real history to our students. And that is just as violent as folks being killed on the streets, because it is killing our spirits and it is killing our freedom. And this is so important. This is so important to talk about, and it's so important to address. And I encourage everyone here today to bring at least one teacher or educator with them. Wow. On July 25th to Million Peoples March, because there's so many teachers who, and I don't like the language around teachers being necessarily complacent, but more so there's fear there. Teachers are scared, and they're scared to speak out because their job is on the line. They have families to take care of, and they have responsibilities of their own. Especially educators of color, there's so much risk that we take teaching these topics in the classroom. And so we need to encourage educators and teachers to know that there is support for us out there, and that this work is being supported by a community of people who literally came out and supported me to the point where I cannot express how grateful I am for that community, and I cannot express how powerful it is to see educators and teachers coming together to organize around this. So I encourage you all to be there on July 25th, but also to bring a teacher or educator that you know. Thank you so much.
Now, maybe you don't think a school teacher should have her students write to a convicted prisoner, even though Amnesty International and a host of other groups think he didn't get a fair trial. Fair enough. The principal could have reprimanded her or suspended her, but the school board fired her. How can that be justified? And maybe the comparison is way out of line, but a thought occurred to me. What if it was 1970 and a teacher had her class write letters to John McCain, who was a prisoner of war in Vietnam for being an Air Force bomber who bombed who knows what in the northern part of Vietnam? What would happen to that teacher for sending letters to John McCain? And now a bit of an interview I did with Lawrence Hamm just before the Newark March.
I understand people are coming from as far as Boston and Atlanta for the rally. It sounds like it will be quite an important march.
Yes, and I'm glad to hear that people are coming from different parts of the country. You mentioned Boston, Atlanta, Connecticut, and Buffalo, New York, upstate New York, and Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. There'll be a wide range of geographic locations represented at the march on Saturday. So we look forward to seeing people who are going to be there. And we expect a good turnout, and it'll be an exciting day, I believe.
When we covered your outreach meeting in New York, you said there will be a speakers program before and after the march. Can you mention some of the people, the speakers, the entertainment, and so on? Right. Well, we certainly will have some well-known people such as Professor Cornel West, who's certainly well-known among your audience and your constituents. We'll have Sister Pam Africa, who has been fighting on behalf of Mumia, Jamal, and political prisoners and oppressed people for a long, long time. And Brother Daruba Ben Mahad, the former Black Panther Party leader, who was a political prisoner and who is now doing work around the issue of prisons and also around the issue of police terrorism. So there'll be a wide range of speakers, and there'll be speakers of grassroots organizations that have been working around the issues of police brutality, racial injustice, and economic inequality for years.
Now, after seeing a post about an important meeting in Turkey in support of democratic and left forces in Syria, I interviewed one of the people involved, Yasser Munif, a Boston professor who supports the Syrian revolution. Here's a portion of our talk. I'm speaking to Yasser Munif. He's a professor at Emerson College in Boston. He teaches courses on race relations, urban sociology, nationalism, political economy, and Middle Eastern politics. He's active with the Global Campaign for Solidarity with the Syrian Revolution. He's presently in Istanbul, Turkey. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
I saw an enthusiastic Facebook post you wrote about an Istanbul declaration concerning Syria. Can you tell us about it?
Yes. So last week, a number of activists and political parties and intellectuals met in Istanbul for 2 days to discuss the Syrian situation, the Syrian revolution, and tried to start a global campaign, that supports the Syrian revolution. And they were activists and party members from Argentina, Spain, Turkey, Holland, and obviously Syrians and Lebanese and others. The main purpose of this campaign and the meeting is basically to show that there is still a leftist presence and leftist support for the Syrian revolution, and to clarify some of the positions of the left on Syria and the Syrian revolution. There was a declaration at the end of that meeting.
And one of the slogans that was put forth was "Break the siege on the Syrian revolution." Is that right?
Right. So one of the important conclusion of that meeting is that the Syrian revolution has been besieged and is under siege right now by a number of different forces. Obviously, the most important is the Syrian regime, but also the countries and the forces allied to it. In addition to that, the Gulf countries, the West, and a number of different countries such as Turkey and so on. There are also fundamentalist forces that are playing an important role in besieging and undermining the popular revolution and the popular forces. And obviously ISIS and what ISIS is doing in the region is another way of besieging and killing the Syrian revolution.
Now, one of the things in the statement was that 300,000 have been killed, and that's horrific. I had not seen such a number. Of course, I can believe it. It also said 95% killed by Assad forces. Now, I've never seen that claim before. How is that estimated? Could that be true?
So that number is basically the number of civilian. So we're talking about 95% of the civilian killed were killed by the Syrian regime. We're not talking about the Syrian army or the opposition military forces. So the Syrian regime has been doing most of the civilian killing, unfortunately. And that number is supported by a number of different organizations and groups and reports. It's obviously an estimate, but there is a lot of evidence that the Syrian regime has been killing most of the civilians.
Mm-hmm. Another thing it says is that the army is so depleted, Assad's army, that many Iranian generals lead part of it. If you could, they're actually leading Syrian troops, these Iranians?
That's true. So the Iranian, for the most part, have been playing a role in the leadership. In some areas, they take over completely and they lead Syrian troops. And in others, they basically give advice and meet quite frequently with Syrian generals and so on.
Now, since you're in Istanbul, I wanted to ask about a recent demonstration. I understand either yesterday or the day before, there was a demonstration because a bomber had killed tens of people in a town called Suruk near the Syrian border. And the press says it was the Islamic State that did the attack, but the people in Istanbul were angry with the Turkish government. Can you explain that?
So many Turks think that the AKP, the party led by Erdogan here in Turkey, has been complicit with ISIS, and there is evidence for that. Part of it, if you remember, when ISIS took over Mosul, they took over the Turkish consulate, and they had a number of Turkish officials hostages, and the Turks were able to free them without much communication how they did that. But in addition to that, it's clear that the ISIS fighters have been able to go to Syria through the Turkish borders, and the Turks have basically either been negligent or unwilling to stop that. But the most obvious evidence of the kind of support that the Turkish government is giving to ISIS is what happened few months ago when Kobani was surrounded by ISIS, and where they were about to take it over almost 6 months ago. The ISIS forces went into Turkey and were fighting the Kurdish forces from within Turkey for at least 8 to 10 hours. And the Turkish army pulled over their forces and removed them at least 1 or 2 miles from the borders. And they stated that they were fearful that there might be some Turkish casualties, and that's why they removed their forces, which is a very bad excuse. Basically, the Turkish sovereignty was violated, and they didn't do anything. On the contrary, they were helping ISIS basically confront and attack the Kurds from behind. And the number
So the people had a demonstration unhappiness with the general treatment of the Turkish government towards Syria and what's going on.
So it's clear that the Turkish government is using ISIS to fight the Kurds, which are the enemy number one for the Turkish government here. The PKK, the Kurdish Turkish group, is supporting the Syrian Kurdish group, obviously. And the PKK is considered a terrorist organization in Turkey, and the enemy number one. So they have been using ISIS to fight the Kurds, and people are upset. Most recently, the Kurdish party was able to get up to 80 seats in the parliament. The elections took place a month ago, and the HDP, which is the Kurdish party, was able to enter the parliament with a sizable number of representatives. And so that's putting an additional challenge for the Turkish government.
Now, from the Left Forum this spring, Eddie Conway talks about a very special media, independent prison media. Conway was a Black Panther and was sent to prison for 40 years. Many people believe he was totally innocent. He now works as a reporter for Baltimore's The Real News.
While I was in jail, after I got locked up, and while I was in jail, we organized a prisoner labor union, we organized independent political parties in the prison system to demand our rights, to do some other things, and to stop the brutality that was going on in the prison system. And so we had like hundreds and hundreds of people involved, inside and outside. But we couldn't stop the things that were going on until we decided that we would organize a guerrilla radio station in the prison system. So at night, 2 or 3 times a week, we would broadcast in the prison system out to the immediate area, which is like maybe a mile around, what was going on to the prisoners, what the prisoners had to say. It was that guerrilla revolutionary radio station that caused them to start changing. First they looked for it, and then, and we would have to constantly move it. And then they started straightening up some of the stuff that they had been doing to us. Afterwards, they spread us all out, they shipped us around because they had identified us and so on. So we end up throughout the whole entire Maryland prison system But during the 80s, this occurred during the 70s, during the 80s and the 90s, there was no news. The movement, it appeared to die. Around 2000, it was clear that there was no activity in America that was progressive and on the left. But that's what the major multinational corporate-owned news media was presenting. That's what we were receiving inside the prison system. And at some point, we decided to look outside of America at the news networks. And I hate to promote this, but we looked at BBC, we looked at Al Jazeera, we looked at Chinese news, we looked at RT, we looked at news operations outside of America, and we discovered that there was more activity happening in America than we was getting from the major news networks. We could watch news networks all day long and wouldn't think anything was going on. And you turn on RT and that's Russian TV, and they were reporting all kinds of things that were going on. They were reporting about the activities down on the ground. So we would have to go to other continents to find out what was happening in our city.
More of Conway's talk in a future program. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.